top of the middle of the day to you, ladies and gentlemen. We're outside. I didn't like the start necessarily of this session, so we're on a different day, hence all the whiteness. So we're going to do a little follow-up session on the initial installment of the Faller's Corner, and that is a play on words too, just so we're all on the up and up there. I was talking about why I run my chains so tight. Had a lot to do with the angle of the placement of the tooth on the rails, and I kind of explained that, I thought, fairly well. But we'll just review for a second. So when your chain's loose, it allows the tooth to heel back on the rails, and it changes the cutting angles and the contact, the way it makes contact with the wood in the kerf, changes the drag on the stops as well. And so I kind of have a tendency to run my chains a little bit tight because they cut better. It's just kind of the way it works. One thing that I didn't really discuss, though, was the other part of the equation, which we're going to deal with that now. So the engine spins, and essentially inside the drum is a clutch, and through centrifugal force, the spinning motion overcomes the resistance that the springs provide on the shoes. The shoes make contact, the drum spins. So we understand the centrifugal clutch concept. Now, we're going to look at the chain spinning around as the engine's working, basically. The centrifugal force is also in effect on the chain itself, and it's trying to blow the chain off of the rim. So what's going to happen is you're going to get a whip effect as it comes around, because you're trying to change the direction in a really short amount of distance and a relatively tight circumference. And so, tight radius, technically, I guess, if you want to talk about it like that. The arc is really tight. You're talking, it's a couple inches at the most. It's going from that way toward the back, the power head, out the front, spitting the chain out the front. So what happens is, as the chain is coming around at a high rate of speed, which they turn at a high rate of speed, it's having a tendency to lift the chain up off of the sprocket, and the chain will actually get kind of a whip effect where it'll heel down a little bit in the back again, and it's more dramatic the more loose the chain is, and then it'll kind of do this little wobble thing, and it'll make contact with the back of the bar. Now, I used to race motocross when I was younger and a little bit more fearless, and there were these guys that had this, I don't know what it was exactly. I never really paid much attention to it. I mean, I kind of looked at them. I never purchased one. They called it an ATAC. It basically, if you look at a motorcycle, they have to have a certain amount of play, looseness in the chain, because the rear wheel travels such a great distance, and they don't want too much bind happening. But if you watch those chains, especially if they go around the back sprocket, it's not so pronounced on the front sprocket. That chain will come around, and it'll actually hook up, and the chain will actually bend a little bit as it's still trying to come around. That's tension, essentially. Tension in the chain, but it's still trying to lift it up. So it's lifting up as it's coming off the sprocket, but it's still trying to hook it around, and it gets this funky little twist in it, and then it straightens out and it takes off. Now, the ATAC was designed, and it had basic idlers that were sprocket size, and they were set apart up by where the pivot happened, and that chain didn't behave the same way because it came off of the sprocket, and instead of the rear sprockets are big, instead of coming off the rear sprocket and trying to head down, it went straight out. So we kind of segued off so we could demonstrate conceptually there are people out there that understand the dynamics of what's happening, and they've tried to alleviate that situation. For the life of me, I cannot figure out, other than a serious cost factor, why the sprocket in the front of a motorcycle isn't actually in the pivot point. Then you wouldn't have like the same kind of dynamics that act upon the chain as the chain is going through the motion of you going over jumps, whoops, coming off of jumps, whatever it might be. I always thought that was kind of an interesting concept, why we haven't seen the sprocket. So they've reduced the size of the sprockets and moved them closer to the pivot point of the swing arm, and that's helped the process. So segued off kind of into outer space, but conceptually it's a chain making a tight radius under power, and even a great radius under power at a pretty high rate of speed. You get this whip effect. Now, we're going to take a little pause here, and we're going to run this thing. We're going to show what I'm talking about out in the tip, and then we're going to come back to this part. Talking about the problem with the chain kind of flying off the handle. I already kind of demonstrated that a little bit, but we're going to demonstrate it with the front part of this bar now, but I'm going to have to reposition the camera and get it so you can see, actually watch what's going on. Now, if we take a look at the chain, I can't say that it's super tight, and yet we've watched how it was rolling around and trying to throw it off. The gap was further here, and as I tightened up the chain, that chain stopped having that whip effect. So that's my, I don't know if it's an interpretation based on years and years of data, but you don't seem to wear your tips out usually nearly as quickly, I would say, as when you're running your chain loose, and this isn't even tight yet. And so I thought maybe we could do a little bit of a visual, taking an actual look at the process. All right, so we're back on track here. Sometimes duty calls and you end up doing another project that wasn't in the plan at the moment. Marriage has a tendency to do that. Now we're looking at what happens. So you have two kinds of forces, the main ones that are happening out on the tip. You have centrifugal force, which is trying to blow the chain off of the tip. And then you have centripetal force, which is the opposite. That's keeping the chain on the tip. So the tension in the chain is actually what provides the centripetal force in the process. So we watched as the chain was really loose, it kind of came around, and it kind of got this funky little bind in it, and then it would make contact at a kind of an interesting angle as it rolled around and hit the top of the bar rails. And it's pretty much right here in this area where it's rough on this bar. It kind of whipped around, and then it came in kind of off. It came off, but the chain kind of had a bind in it, and then it hit the rail, and then it started to go through the process of running down the rail with both front and back side of the strap actually touching the rail. So it made contact first in a funky pattern. So we also watched it as I tightened up the adjuster for the bar, essentially, basically tensioner, and we watched that chain change the way the dynamics were happening. So I guess that's kind of an exaggerated concept of what the process was, but for visual aspects, and I know there are guys out there that run their chains pretty loose, but I never do, because like I said, you end up getting a little bit more wear on things from what I've seen. Now if we look at the new style tips for a second, these are both a couple of bars that I've owned for a long time, put a lot of mileage on them. You can see they're mushroomed out, and I run my tips pretty tight, but we're talking there's several million board feet cut on both of these bars. They're not something that I use for a few days. I used them and used them and used them and used them. And so I don't know if there's the same amount of volume. There's no way I would be able to track that on these two bars. If we want to talk about that, the steel in this bar here seems to be a little bit better than the steel in this bar right here. The rails seem to last a little bit longer, and yet we're seeing the same kind of indentation here. I'm thinking this has cut a lot more volume based on that concept. So we kind of went off course there for a second. If we look at it here, I think we're pretty good to go now. Maybe we could drop this down a fuzz. Alright, so what's happening at the back of the process is the same thing that's happening out in the front. The centrifugal force is trying to blow this chain off of the sprocket as it rolls around. It actually comes up high because it's trying to kick it out that way. The centripetal force is coming from the tension in the chain, which is holding it onto the sprocket, otherwise it'd just blow off the back. But it comes up high and then starts to hook around because there's tension in the chain, and it makes contact in a funky way on the strap. It doesn't actually hit at the same time on both front and back of the strap, the little wear pattern. I don't know what you want to call these, the bottom parts of the strap. There's the heel, and then there's the front part of it, but they don't make contact with the rails simultaneously. The looser the chain is, the worse and more exaggerated that process actually is. So the other part of why I run my chains tight is you don't get that funky, the way they make contact with the heel. They don't come up, roll down, pound on the heel of the bar, and then take off. And so that's just my interpretation of that actually happening based on what you see, what we saw with the tip, and then understanding the physics aspect of what's actually taking place. We're wrapping up the second installment of the Faller's Corner. This is a continuance of the first session where we were discussing, we being me, I'm assuming that we are involved in the process, so we are discussing why I run my chains as tight as I do. We talked about that initial part of it, and then this session covered the second part of why I do that, a little more in detail on some of the physical aspects of what's happening in the process. I'm hopeful that you found a little tidbit in this session that was noteworthy, and I do thank you for taking the time to stop by and check out my small offerings in this YouTube experience. I do appreciate the amount of subs that I have, I didn't really pay much attention to it, and then I was kind of looking at it after somebody brought something to my attention, and I realized that I have a fair amount for being such a small fry in this operation. So thanks to everybody for all the subs out there, much appreciated. And again, thanks for stopping by and watching this session of the Faller's Corner. I hope that you have a blessed day wherever you might be on God's green earth.